He left the city before sunrise with a quiet certainty that felt older than his own thoughts. The streets were still damp from a night rain and the air carried that soft metallic scent that always appears just before morning begins to breathe. He carried only what he could fit into a worn canvas pack, a small knife, a steel bottle, a blanket, and a journal whose pages were still untouched. There had been no dramatic farewell, no final message, no attempt to explain what he himself barely understood. It was not escape, not exactly, but something closer to a return. For years he had felt a low, constant hum beneath his life, a tension that no amount of rest seemed to dissolve. It followed him through crowded rooms and silent nights alike, whispering that something essential had been misplaced. And so he chose to walk away from noise, from schedules, from the invisible weight of expectations, and step instead into the slow and patient rhythm of the natural world. The path into the forest was narrow and unmarked, a faint suggestion between tall grasses that brushed gently against his legs as he passed. The sky slowly softened from deep blue into pale gold, and with each step the sounds of the city faded into a distant memory, replaced by the layered music of birds, wind, and rustling leaves. There was no urgency here, no demand for speed, and he found his breathing changing without effort, growing deeper, steadier. As if the forest itself was teaching him how to exist again. He did not think about the 6 months ahead in any structured way. He had decided only that he would remain, that he would observe, and that he would allow whatever needed to change within him to do so without resistance. By mid-morning he reached a clearing where sunlight spilled freely onto the earth, warming it in a way that felt almost intentional. A small stream curved along one edge, its water clear enough to reveal the smooth stones beneath. He paused there, setting down his pack, and listened. Not just to the sounds around him, but to the absence of everything else. No distant engines, no voices, no digital interruptions. Only the steady presence of the world as it existed without him. It was both comforting and unsettling, this realization that life continued so completely without his participation. He knelt by the stream and dipped his hands into the cold water, letting it run over his skin, grounding himself in the sensation. The cold traveled through him in a way that felt clean and precise, waking parts of his awareness that had long been dulled. He drank slowly, tasting the mineral sharpness, and noticed how different it felt from anything processed or contained. There was a clarity to it, an honesty. As the sun climbed higher, he began to build a simple shelter using fallen branches and a large, leaning tree as support. His movements were awkward at first, inefficient, shaped by years of convenience rather than necessity. But there was no one to judge, no timeline to meet. Each mistake became a quiet lesson. Each small success, like securing a stable branch or finding the right angle for the structure, brought a subtle satisfaction that he had not felt in a long time. By evening, the shelter stood modest but functional. He gathered dry leaves and layered them beneath his blanket, creating a softness that felt earned rather than purchased. The light shifted again, the golden tones deepening into amber and then into shadow. As darkness approached, the forest did not fall silent, but instead transformed, new sounds emerging, slower, softer, yet no less alive. He lay down and looked up through the gaps in the branches, where pieces of the sky revealed themselves one by one as stars. There was no artificial glow to dim them, no distraction to pull his gaze away. He felt small in a way that was not frightening, but freeing. The hum that had followed him for so long seemed to loosen slightly, as if it too were unsure how to exist here. His last waking thought was not a plan or a worry, but a simple observation. That for the first time in years, nothing was demanding anything from him. And in that quiet absence, something within him began, almost imperceptibly, to rest. The first nights unfolded slowly, like a language he did not yet fully understand but felt drawn to learn. Darkness in the forest was not empty, it was textured, layered with sound and movement that his senses struggled to interpret at first. Every rustle seemed deliberate, every distant call carried a meaning he could not yet grasp. He lay still beneath his makeshift shelter, listening with a heightened awareness that bordered on tension, his body unsure whether to rest or remain alert. Sleep came in fragments, shallow and easily broken, as if his mind had not yet accepted that it was safe to surrender. The ground beneath him held the warmth of the day for a while, but as the hours passed, the cold crept in gradually, pressing through the layers of leaves and fabric. He adjusted often, pulling the blanket tighter, curling slightly to preserve heat. It was a physical discomfort he had rarely experienced in such a direct and uninterrupted way, and yet it did not feel entirely negative. There was a clarity in it, a reminder that his body was not separate from the environment, but in constant conversation with it. On the second night, the sounds felt less foreign. He began to distinguish patterns, the rhythmic chirping of insects, the occasional movement of small animals through the underbrush, the soft shifting of branches overhead. What had seemed chaotic now revealed itself as structured, even predictable in its own quiet way. His breathing followed these patterns unconsciously, slowing, deepening, aligning with the cadence of the forest. When he closed his eyes, he no longer felt surrounded by unknown threats, but held within a vast and living system that did not concern itself with him. Days were simpler. He spent them exploring the immediate area, learning the contours of the land, the direction of the stream, the places where sunlight lingered longest. He practiced small tasks repeatedly, improving without pressure. Gathering wood became easier. Building a small fire, once an uncertain effort, turned into a steady and almost meditative process. He learned how to listen not just with his ears, but with his attention, noticing subtle changes in light, in temperature, in the behavior of birds and insects. Hunger sharpened his awareness. Food was no longer an afterthought or a convenience, but something that required presence and patience. He foraged carefully, testing what he found with caution, relying on instinct and observation. Each successful discovery, a cluster of edible berries, a patch of roots, carried a quiet sense of accomplishment that felt deeply satisfying. Eating became an intentional act, slow and focused, each bite recognized and appreciated in a way that had long been absent from his life. By the third night, something shifted. As he lay down, the tension that had once held his body rigid began to dissolve. His muscles softened against the ground, and his breathing settled into a natural rhythm without effort. The sounds of the forest, once sharp and intrusive, blended into a continuous and gentle backdrop. They no longer demanded his attention, but supported it, like a distant, steady lullaby. Sleep came more easily then. Not all at once, but in longer stretches, deeper, more restorative. He dreamed, though he could not remember the details upon waking, only the lingering sense that his mind had traveled somewhere unburdened. When he opened his eyes in the early light of morning, there was a brief moment of disorientation, followed by a calm recognition of where he was, and why. The hum within him had not disappeared, but it had changed. It was softer now, less insistent, as if it were gradually losing its grip. In its place, there was a growing space, a quiet openness that he did not try to define. He simply noticed it, the way one notices the slow brightening of the sky before sunrise. And as he sat by the stream, watching the water move with effortless continuity, he realized that for the first time, his thoughts were not racing ahead or circling back. They were present, contained within the moment, moving at the same unhurried pace as everything around him. By the end of the first week, his body began to change in ways that were subtle yet undeniable, as if it were remembering something it had always known but long forgotten. The stiffness that had lingered in his shoulders and back from years of sitting in stillness slowly dissolved, replaced by a quiet strength that came not from effort, but from necessity. Each movement carried purpose now. Walking was no longer just a means of getting somewhere, it was a full-body experience, the shifting of weight, the balance of each step, the awareness of the ground beneath him. His feet, once protected and disconnected, grew more sensitive, learning the language of the earth through texture and pressure. His hands changed as well. Small cuts and scratches appeared, then healed, the skin gradually toughening, adapting to the demands placed upon it. He noticed how quickly his body responded when given the chance, how efficiently it repaired itself when not overwhelmed by constant stress and artificial rhythms. Even his breathing deepened further, no longer shallow and automatic, but full and steady, expanding into his chest and abdomen with a natural ease. Mornings became his favorite time. He would wake just before the sun, not by alarm but by a gentle internal shift, as if his body had aligned itself with the turning of the earth. The air at that hour was cool and clean, carrying a stillness that felt almost sacred. He would sit quietly, watching as light slowly touched the tops of trees, then spilled downward, revealing the world piece by piece. In those moments, he felt a calm clarity that required no effort to maintain. Hunger, once an inconvenience, became a guide. His body signaled its needs clearly, without confusion or excess. When he found food, he ate with attention, noticing how different plants affected his energy, how some nourished him deeply while others offered only brief satisfaction. There was a growing intelligence in this process, not learned from books or instruction, but from direct experience. He began to trust it. Sleep deepened further. The interruptions faded, replaced by long, uninterrupted stretches of rest that left him feeling fully restored. He noticed how quickly his body settled at night, how naturally it released the day without resistance. The ground no longer felt hard or uncomfortable, but supportive, as if it were holding him rather than pressing against him. His senses sharpened. He could detect faint sounds at a distance, distinguish subtle variations in scent carried by the wind, notice slight shifts in temperature that signaled changes in weather. This heightened awareness did not feel overwhelming, but natural, as if it had always been available, waiting beneath layers of distraction. There was also a new relationship with silence. In the past, silence had often felt empty, something to be filled or avoided. Here, it was full, rich with detail, offering a space in which his thoughts could settle without being crowded. He found himself thinking less, not because he forced it, but because there was simply less need. The constant internal dialogue that had once defined his days began to quiet, leaving behind a more direct experience of the present. One afternoon, as he climbed a gentle slope overlooking the clearing, he paused and noticed something unexpected. His body did not feel heavy or resistant, but light, responsive, almost effortless in its movement. There was no strain in his breathing, no tension in his muscles. He stood there for a moment, feeling the subtle strength that had developed without deliberate training, and understood that this was not improvement in the way he had once measured it. It was alignment. The hum within him continued to fade, replaced by a steady, grounded presence. It was not excitement, not even happiness in the usual sense, but something deeper and more stable. A quiet sense of being exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what was required, without excess or deficiency. And as he descended back toward his shelter, the forest around him no longer felt like a place he was visiting. It felt, in a way he could not fully explain, like something he was becoming part of. As the second week gave way to the third, the most profound changes were no longer in his body, but in the landscape of his mind. Thoughts, once constant and overlapping, began to arrive one at a time, each distinct, each allowed to pass without resistance. There was no longer a need to follow every idea to its conclusion, no impulse to solve or control. They appeared, lingered briefly, and dissolved, like ripples in the stream beside his shelter. In their absence, a quiet clarity emerged, not forced, not constructed, but simply revealed. He noticed how much of his previous life had been shaped by anticipation. Thinking ahead, preparing, worrying, replaying conversations, imagining outcomes that never arrived. Here, those patterns had little ground to stand on. There was no schedule to organize, no expectations to meet, no social fabric requiring constant adjustment. The present moment expanded to fill his awareness completely, leaving little room for unnecessary projection. Time itself seemed to change. Days were no longer divided into rigid segments, but flowed continuously from morning to night without sharp edges. He marked their passage not by hours, but by light, by the angle of the sun, by the gradual cooling of the air. This fluid sense of time brought with it a deep sense of ease. There was nothing to rush toward, nothing to delay. Each action arose naturally from the conditions around him. He began to sit for longer periods without doing anything at all. At first, this had felt unfamiliar, even slightly uncomfortable, but now it became one of the most natural states he could enter. Sitting by the stream, or beneath the shade of a tree, he would simply observe. The movement of water, the shifting patterns of light, the subtle interactions between insects and plants. His attention rested gently on these details, without effort, without distraction. Memories still surfaced, but they no longer carried the same emotional weight. Events that once felt significant, even overwhelming, appeared now as distant and neutral, like scenes from a story he had read long ago. There was no urge to analyze them, no need to assign meaning. They existed, and then they passed. With this mental stillness came a new sensitivity to his internal state. He could detect the smallest shifts in mood or energy, noticing how they arose and faded without attachment. There was a growing trust in this process, a recognition that nothing needed to be held on to or pushed away. Everything moved, everything changed, and that was enough. One evening, as the light softened and shadows stretched across the clearing, he became aware of a depth of silence he had never experienced before. It was not the absence of sound, the forest was still alive with subtle noise, but something beneath that. A quiet that seemed to exist within him rather than around him. It was steady, unmoving, unaffected by external conditions. He remained there for a long time, sitting on the ground, his body relaxed, his breathing slow and even. There was no sense of boredom, no desire for stimulation. Just a simple, complete presence. In that moment, he realized that the hum which had once followed him so persistently had almost entirely disappeared. Not suppressed, not resolved, but dissolved, as if it had never truly belonged. This did not feel like an achievement. There was no pride in it, no sense of having reached a goal. It felt natural, inevitable even, given the conditions he had allowed himself to enter. A return rather than a transformation. As night settled in, he lay down beneath his shelter and closed his eyes. Sleep came quickly, deeply, without interruption. His mind did not resist, did not wander. It simply let go. And in the quiet darkness, held by the steady rhythm of the forest, he rested more completely than he ever had before. By the end of the first month, he no longer felt like someone adapting to the forest, but like someone who had always belonged to it. The distinction between himself and his surroundings had softened in a way that was difficult to describe, yet unmistakable in experience. His days unfolded in a rhythm that required no planning, guided instead by light, temperature, hunger, and an intuitive awareness that had grown steadily stronger. He woke with the dawn, not because he chose to, but because his body moved in quiet agreement with the rising sun. He slept when darkness settled fully, without resistance or delay. His movements became more efficient, almost instinctive. He no longer hesitated when gathering wood or searching for food. His hands moved with quiet confidence, selecting what was needed, leaving what was not. He noticed how little effort was required when he stopped overthinking, when he allowed his body to respond directly to the environment. Tasks that once seemed complex now felt simple, even effortless, as if they had been waiting for him to remember how to do them. The forest revealed itself in layers. What had once appeared as a uniform landscape now showed variation and detail. He recognized certain trees not just by shape, but by presence. He knew where the ground held more moisture, where certain plants grew more abundantly, where animals tended to pass. This knowledge was not memorized, but absorbed, becoming part of his perception without conscious effort. His senses had grown precise. He could feel changes in the air before they became visible. A subtle shift in wind direction, a faint drop in temperature, a quiet stillness among the birds, all signaled the approach of rain. He prepared without urgency, adjusting his shelter, gathering what he needed, moving in alignment with the coming change rather than reacting to it. Rain itself became an experience he welcomed. At first, he had avoided it, seeking cover, protecting himself from discomfort. Now, he allowed himself to remain present within it. The sensation of water on his skin, cool and constant, carried a kind of cleansing simplicity. It washed away not just dirt, but any lingering tension, leaving behind a renewed clarity. He would stand sometimes at the edge of the clearing, letting the rain fall freely, his eyes closed, his breath steady, fully aware of the moment without needing to define it. Food continued to shape his days, but it no longer felt like a challenge. He had learned enough to sustain himself with consistency. His body responded with quiet gratitude, his energy stable, his movement strong and balanced. There was no excess, no indulgence, only what was needed. And in that simplicity, there was a satisfaction far deeper than anything he had known before. His physical form had changed noticeably. His muscles, once tense and rigid, had become lean and responsive. His posture straightened naturally, without effort. His skin, exposed to sun and air, took on a deeper tone, marked by the environment but not harmed by it. He felt grounded, solid, yet light within himself. But perhaps the most profound shift was in his sense of separation. He no longer experienced himself as an observer moving through the forest, but as part of its ongoing process. The same forces that shaped the trees, the water, the animals, were shaping him as well. There was no boundary in the way he had once imagined, only a continuous interaction, a shared existence. One afternoon, as he sat beside the stream, watching the steady flow of water over stone, he realized that he had not felt loneliness since arriving. Not once. The absence of human presence did not register as emptiness, but as space, full and complete in its own way. There was connection here, not in words or gestures, but in something more fundamental. He dipped his hands into the stream again, as he had on his first day, but the sensation was different now. It was not just refreshing, but familiar, as if the water recognized him as much as he recognized it. He stayed there for a long time, his hands resting in the current, his mind still, his body at ease. As the sun began to lower, casting long shadows across the clearing, he stood and returned to his shelter with an unhurried step. There was nothing to anticipate, nothing to resolve. Only the continuation of a rhythm that had become as natural as his own breath. And in that rhythm, he found a quiet, enduring sense of belonging that required no explanation. Toward the middle of the second month, the change was no longer on the surface, it began to be felt in deeper layers. The days were still flowing with the same calm rhythm, but what he noticed within that rhythm was more subtle, more detailed, and richer. When he woke up in the mornings, he was no longer just aware of the arrival of light, but how it arrived. The first light filtering through the trees touched the highest branches first, then slowly descended, eventually reaching the ground. This transition was not a matter of a few seconds but a long process, and he was now patient enough to observe every stage of it. His body had now fully adapted. His muscles were not only strong but also extremely balanced. After long walks, he did not feel tired, on the contrary, he gained a kind of vitality. The soles of his feet had thickened and had become more sensitive to the ground. Stone, soil, moisture, dryness. He could distinguish all of them the moment he stepped. This sensory sensitivity made his movements more conscious. He no longer thought about where to step, his body already knew. His eating habits became even more refined. He began to notice which plant was more nourishing at which time of day. He observed that some leaves he gathered early in the morning were fresher and more effective, while the same plant felt heavier in the afternoon. This knowledge had not been taught to him, it had formed entirely through experience. The relationship between what he ate and his body had become much more direct. After eating something, he could instantly understand his body's response. Mentally, there was a clarity he had never experienced before. Thoughts had almost completely withdrawn. In their place was a state he called awareness. In this state, there was no need to think, because everything was already perceived as it was. He did not need to think to solve a problem, because no problem arose that needed solving. Everything was sufficient as it was. The nights, on the other hand, gained a deeper dimension. It was no longer just sleep, it was almost like dissolving. When he lay down, he continued to feel his body. Yet at the same time felt as if he was going beyond it. The boundary between the beginning of sleep and wakefulness had blurred. Sometimes, even with his eyes closed, he could sense his surroundings, perceive the direction of the wind and the density of the air. This was not frightening, on the contrary, it felt completely natural. One night, a gentle breeze began. The leaves of the trees moved slowly, creating a faint murmur. As he listened to this sound, he noticed something. The sound was not only coming from outside, but also resonating within him. It was as if there was no longer any distinction between the outer world and the inner world. Everything he heard existed both outside and inside at the same time. Emotionally, he had almost completely stabilized. There were no sudden highs or lows. The word peace did not fully capture this state, because it was not just calmness. It was a much deeper balance. It was as if emotions had ceased to be surface movements and had turned into the still water beneath a deep lake. One day, while walking, he stopped and looked around. The same trees, the same path, the same sky. But his perception was completely different. He was no longer looking, he was directly seeing. There was no interpretation in between, no labels, no meanings carried over from the past. Everything was as it was, clear as if being seen for the first time. The concept of time had dissolved even further. He no longer knew which day it was, nor did he feel the need to know. The 6-month goal still existed in his mind, but it was not a countdown, just a distant reminder. The true reality was the moment he was in. When he sat again by the stream in the evening, he looked at the water. But this time, he was not just watching its flow. He felt himself as a part of that flow. Without thinking, without effort, just naturally. And in that moment, he realized something: he was no longer living in nature. Nature had begun to live within him. By the beginning of the 3rd month, the changes within him became so refined that they were almost impossible to measure, yet impossible to deny. Nothing dramatic occurred on the surface, no sudden realizations or visible transformations, yet something essential continued to reorganize itself quietly beneath his awareness. It was as if his entire system, body and mind together, had entered a deeper calibration, adjusting not just to survive in nature, but to synchronize with it completely. He no longer thought in terms of actions and outcomes. Instead, there was a continuous flow of response. When he moved, it was not because he had decided to, but because movement was the natural continuation of the moment. When he stopped, there was no question of why. This absence of internal negotiation created a profound efficiency. There was no wasted energy, no hesitation, no internal conflict. Everything he did felt precise, even when it was simple. His perception of space expanded. He became aware not only of objects and sounds, but of the distance between them, the invisible relationships that connected everything. The way wind moved through branches was no longer random, it followed patterns that he could feel rather than analyze. The movement of animals in the distance did not startle him anymore because he sensed their presence before they appeared. This was not a skill he had learned consciously, but something that had emerged as his attention became less fragmented. Physically, his body reached a state of quiet optimization. His movements required less effort, his endurance increased without strain, and his recovery was almost immediate. Even small injuries disappeared quickly, leaving behind no lingering discomfort. His posture remained naturally aligned whether he was walking, sitting, or resting. There was no tension to correct because tension rarely formed. His breathing became one of the most noticeable anchors of this transformation. It was consistently slow, deep, and unforced, adapting seamlessly to his activity without conscious control. Sometimes, as he sat still, he noticed that his breath became so subtle it nearly disappeared, yet there was no discomfort, no urgency to inhale. In those moments, he felt suspended in a state of complete ease, as if the boundary between breathing and being had dissolved. The forest, too, responded differently to his presence. Or perhaps it was more accurate to say that he no longer disrupted it. Animals moved nearby without alarm. Birds continued their patterns even when he sat within view. There was no sense of intrusion. He had become neutral within the environment, neither threat nor anomaly, simply another living form moving within the same system. One afternoon, while resting beneath a large tree at the edge of the clearing, he experienced something he could not fully explain. There was a brief moment where his sense of self, the feeling of being located behind his eyes, dissolved completely. There was still perception, still sound, still sensation, but no center from which they were being observed. Everything existed equally, without hierarchy. The tree, the wind, the ground, and what he had once called himself were no longer separate elements, but part of a single, continuous field. The moment passed gently, without resistance or confusion. He did not try to hold on to it or recreate it. What remained was a quiet understanding that the boundaries he had once assumed were fixed were, in fact, flexible, even illusory. As the days continued, this understanding did not dominate his experience, but it subtly influenced it. There was less attachment to identity, less need to define himself in any way. He did not think about who he was, because the question no longer seemed relevant. Existence itself was enough. His emotional state remained steady, but now carried a faint undertone of something new. Not excitement, not joy in the conventional sense, but a quiet appreciation that seemed to arise without cause. It did not depend on events or conditions. It was simply present, like a background warmth that never fully faded. At night, as he lay beneath the open sky, he noticed how easily he could let go of the day. There were no lingering thoughts, no reflections he felt compelled to revisit. The transition into sleep was immediate and complete, as if his system trusted the cycle fully. And somewhere within that steady, uninterrupted rhythm, the final traces of the person he had been before began to dissolve, not erased, but gently absorbed into something far more expansive and at ease. By the fourth month, the pace of change slowed, not because it had stopped, but because there was less left to rearrange. What remained began to refine itself in silence, in stillness, in moments so subtle they would have once gone unnoticed. His days were no longer marked by learning or adapting, but by a deepening familiarity with a state that now felt entirely natural. The forest did not feel new anymore, and neither did his place within it. Everything had settled into a quiet equilibrium. He spent longer periods doing nothing at all, though it no longer felt like inactivity. Sitting beside the stream or leaning against the trunk of a tree, he would remain there for hours. Fully awake, fully aware, yet without any impulse to act. His attention no longer wandered. It did not need to. There was nothing missing from the present moment that required searching for. In this stillness, perception became extraordinarily clear. He could observe the smallest movements without effort. The way a single leaf trembled before falling. The precise moment a ripple formed in the water before expanding outward. The slight shift in light as clouds passed slowly across the sun. These details were no longer background elements. They were complete experiences in themselves. His sense of time had almost entirely dissolved. Days did not feel long or short. They simply unfolded. There was no anticipation of tomorrow, no reflection on yesterday. Even the idea of the remaining months faded into irrelevance. There was only continuity, an unbroken presence that did not require measurement. Physically, his body had reached a state of quiet harmony. There was no excess tension, no fatigue that lingered beyond its purpose. Hunger came and passed cleanly. Thirst was met with immediate clarity. Sleep remained deep and effortless. Every system within him seemed to function with a kind of intelligence that required no interference. His face had changed as well, though he had no mirror to confirm it. He felt it in the way his muscles rested, in the absence of habitual expressions formed by stress or distraction. There was a softness now, a neutrality that reflected the state of his mind. His eyes, though he could not see them, felt different too, less focused on searching, more open to receiving. Emotionally, he existed in a state that was neither high nor low, but deeply stable. Yet within that stability, there was a subtle richness. A quiet sense of contentment that did not depend on anything external. It was not something he felt strongly, but something that was always there, like a gentle current beneath the surface. One evening, as the sun began to set and the sky shifted through layers of color, he sat by the stream and watched the reflection of the trees in the water. The surface was still, almost perfectly smooth, and for a moment, it became difficult to distinguish what was real and what was reflection. The trees above and their mirrored forms below existed with equal clarity. He leaned slightly forward, studying this balance, and then something within him aligned with what he was seeing. His mind, like the water, had become still enough to reflect reality without distortion. There were no ripples of thought, no disturbances of interpretation. What remained was a direct, unfiltered perception. In that moment, he understood something without needing to put it into words. That clarity was not something to be achieved, but something that emerged when disturbance ceased. That the mind, when left undisturbed, naturally settled into this state, just as water becomes still when untouched. The understanding did not excite him. It did not create a desire to hold on to the moment. It simply integrated, becoming part of the quiet foundation of his awareness. As darkness slowly replaced the remaining light, he remained seated, his posture relaxed, his breathing slow. The forest shifted into its nighttime rhythm, and he shifted with it, without effort. When he finally lay down to sleep, there was no transition, no sense of leaving one state for another. The stillness remained, continuous, unbroken. And in that stillness, he no longer felt like someone experiencing peace. He felt like the peace itself. By the 5th month, something unexpected began to emerge, not as a disruption, but as a quiet reappearance. After weeks of existing in a state that felt almost without identity, traces of the self he once knew began to return, but in a form that was softer, lighter, and no longer dominant. It did not feel like regression. It felt like integration. At first, it appeared as simple thoughts. Memories that arose not as distractions, but as gentle images, like reflections passing across still water. Faces, voices, fragments of conversations, places he had once known. They came without urgency, without emotional pull. He observed them the same way he observed everything else, allowing them to pass without resistance. Then came a subtle awareness of individuality. A recognition that while he was deeply connected to everything around him, he was still a distinct expression within it. This realization did not create separation, but contrast. Just as each tree in the forest stood as its own form while remaining part of the whole, he too existed as both individual and inseparable. His movements began to carry a faint sense of personal expression again. The way he walked, the way he sat, even the way he gathered food, all retained their efficiency and simplicity, but now held a quiet uniqueness. It was not shaped by habit or conditioning, but by something more authentic, something that had remained beneath the surface all along. Emotionally, a new layer unfolded. Not instability, but depth. He began to feel subtle variations again, small shifts in mood that did not disturb his balance, but enriched it. A quiet appreciation for the warmth of sunlight on his skin. A gentle sense of wonder at the complexity of the forest. Even a faint, almost unrecognizable form of longing, not for anything specific, but as a natural movement within being itself. He did not resist these changes. There was no desire to return to the emptiness of pure stillness, nor any fear of losing it. The stillness remained, but now it coexisted with a renewed sense of self. The two did not conflict. They supported each other. One afternoon, while sitting in the clearing, he found himself smiling slightly, without reason. It was not a reaction to anything external, but an expression that arose naturally, without intention. The feeling behind it was quiet, steady, and deeply grounded. It did not come and go. It simply was. His awareness expanded in a different way now. Not outward, but inward, toward the subtle structure of his own experience. He could feel how thoughts formed before they fully appeared, how emotions began as small shifts in sensation before becoming recognizable. This gave him a level of clarity that removed any sense of confusion. Nothing took him by surprise. The forest continued as it always had. Unchanged in its rhythm, yet his relationship to it had matured. He no longer felt like he was dissolving into it, nor simply existing within it. He felt like he was in dialogue with it, a silent exchange where nothing needed to be spoken. As the days passed, the idea of returning began to take shape. Not as a plan, not as a decision, but as a natural extension of the cycle he was part of. Just as seasons changed without force, something within him began to turn toward what would come next. This did not disturb his peace. It did not create anticipation or resistance. It was simply another movement, another shift within the larger flow. One evening, as he stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the last light fade behind the trees, he became aware of both aspects of himself at once. The stillness that had no identity, and the self that could move, choose, and experience. For the first time, they were not separate. And in that quiet union, he understood that what he would carry with him when he left would not be the forest itself, but the way he had learned to be within it. The 6th month did not arrive with a clear beginning. It revealed itself gradually, through a subtle sense of completion that began to form within him. Nothing in the forest had changed, yet something in his perception signaled that the cycle was nearing its natural end. There was no urgency to leave, no impatience, but also no desire to stay indefinitely. What had come to unfold had unfolded. His body now existed in a state of effortless balance. Every movement was precise without being controlled, every action efficient without intention. His strength was quiet, integrated into the way he stood, walked, and rested. There was no excess, no strain, no resistance anywhere within him. Even his heartbeat felt different, slower, steadier, as if it too had aligned with something more fundamental than time. His breathing had become almost imperceptible at rest, deep and complete when needed, but otherwise subtle, continuous, and unforced. It no longer felt like something he was doing, but something that was simply happening, part of a larger rhythm that included everything around him. The boundary between his internal processes and the external world had become so thin that it no longer felt meaningful to distinguish them. His mind remained clear, but not empty. Thoughts were available when needed, precise and functional, but never excessive. There was no background noise. No lingering mental tension. Silence had become the default, not something he had to seek, but something that remained even when thinking occurred. Emotionally, he existed in a state that was both stable and alive. There was a quiet contentment that did not depend on conditions, paired with a subtle openness to experience. He could feel without being overwhelmed, respond without being pulled. There was no fear in him, not because he believed nothing could happen, but because he no longer resisted what might. On one of his final mornings, he woke before the sun and sat in the same place he had sat on his first day. The clearing looked unchanged, yet it felt entirely different. Or perhaps it was he who had changed so completely that the same place now reflected something new. The stream moved as it always had, steady and unbroken. The trees stood in their quiet presence. The air carried that same cool stillness. He placed his hands in the water once more, feeling its familiar clarity. But this time, there was no sense of contrast, no awareness of how it differed from anything else. It was simply part of the same continuous experience that included his body, his breath, his awareness. He did not reflect on the 6 months in any structured way. There was no need to measure progress or define what had been gained. The changes were too deep, too integrated to be observed from a distance. They could only be lived. When he stood up, there was no symbolic gesture, no final look back meant to hold on to the moment. He simply turned and began to walk. The path that had once felt like an entry into the unknown now felt like a natural extension of the same space he had been living in. Each step carried the same presence, the same quiet awareness. Nothing was left behind because nothing had been separate. As the forest slowly opened and the distant signs of the outside world began to reappear, there was no return in the way he might have once imagined. He was not going back to who he had been. That version of himself had dissolved gradually, without conflict, without loss. What remained was simpler. A body that moved in harmony with its environment. A mind that rested in clarity without effort. A presence that did not depend on place. 6 months in nature had not made him into something new. It had removed everything that was not essential. And as he continued forward, stepping quietly into whatever would come next, there was only one thing that remained constant. A steady, unbroken sense of being, untouched by where he was, or where he would go.